Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and this is a reading roundup. In this reading roundup, I want to tell you about the advanced reader copies that I read and reviewed in the month of November. And because there was only one, I'm going to include October as well. But this is primarily the November advanced readers copies that I read. So let's just dive straight into it. I read The Art Fiasco by Fiona Veitch Smith. I think that's how you say her name. This is a historical mystery, and The Art Fiasco is the fifth in the series. Now, I had never read anything by this author or from this series before. The main character is Poppy Denby. She is a 26-year-old journalist and amateur sleuth, and this particular book in the series is set in 1924 in Newcastle. And so I was actually really attracted to the location of this book. I don't know that I've actually read very much set in the north of England, and Newcastle, especially in the 20s. This is the industrial north, so there's a lot of mining, there's a lot of factories. So I thought that was a really interesting setting and location for the mystery. There are two timelines. The first is 1897, where we meet Agnes, who is, I think, like 10 years old. I should have written it down. She's just a child, and her art teacher is found dead at the bottom of the pit shaft. So she lives, that particular piece is in a village just outside of Newcastle in a mining village. And then we have the primary timeline of 1924. Agnes, of course, is now all grown up. She is an artist, and she has an exhibition of her paintings in Newcastle, and she is murdered at the opening of her exhibition. Poppy goes to Newcastle. She's there. She's going to her father's birthday party, and they live just outside of Newcastle. But first, she stops in Newcastle in order to help her aunt move or something or other. I can't remember. I can't remember the details. I really enjoyed this historical mystery. I thought it was really well written. There was a really good sense of time and place. I thought the author wove the time and place really naturally into the story. You know how sometimes you read a story and you get the impression that the author is like, okay, now don't forget, this is in 1924 and it's Newcastle, and here are some ways that will help you remember that. But this, it felt like she just really naturally wove those elements into the story, so that kind of almost without realizing it, you were just always aware that it was 1924 and that you were in Newcastle. So for example, at one point in the story, Poppy goes with a friend of hers to see a film at the cinema, and afterwards they leave and they're talking about the film together, and one of them mentions how the actress in the film that they had just seen was able to convey so much emotion without speaking, and they continue in their discussion of the film they saw. And that's one of those examples where, without the author having to say, this was the era of the, silent film, she reminded you of that through this conversation that the friends were having. The story was told in the third person. I liked a few elements that made it feel kind of golden age. So there was a map of Poppy's 1924 Newcastle at the beginning of the book. I always love it when there's a map. There was a character list at the beginning as well. That just really made it feel like it was a golden age type of mystery. So I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars, and I actually took the first book in the series out from the library because I wanted to start again. It had great characters. Poppy was great. It was that time of like the suffrage movement in the was still happening, although like the bulk of it was kind of in the past. So her aunt and some of her aunt's friends were suffragists, and that played a part in the story. But still, like, Poppy's job as a journalist and being accepted as a journalist and taken seriously as a woman was a big part in the story as well. I just really enjoyed it all around, and I would highly recommend the Poppy Dendy series if you enjoy a good historical mystery. And then I read another historical mystery. A lot of these are going to be historical mysteries, but that's okay. That's what I like. So I read Sherlock Holmes and the Ripper of Whitechapel. This was written by M.K. Wiseman. So this is also another historical mystery. And in this one, Sherlock Holmes is a main character. So I think it is bold for authors to choose to write stories about such iconic characters. But I was impressed. So I have to say I was really leery heading into this. But I was really impressed. I thought the author did a really good job. So it's set in London in 1888. And Scotland Yard asks Sherlock Holmes to help them with the Whitechapel murders, what we would now call the Ripper killings. It's told in the first person, as you would expect of a Sherlock Holmes story. However, it is not Watson who is narrating the story, it's Holmes himself, which I also thought was really interesting. And so at the very beginning I thought, now why did she do that? Because there was a really good reason why Watson was the narrator in the original Arthur Conan Doyle Holmes stories. Watson was the narrator because he was the audience surrogate, but he also, as narrator, allowed Holmes to maintain this aura of mystery and mystique as the great detective. And so having Holmes be the narrator was a really interesting choice. However, the reason why you find out right away, and that's because in investigating the Ripper killings, Holmes really quickly, and so this isn't a spoiler, I think it's even right in the synopsis, Watson emerges as a prime suspect, and Holmes needs to figure out what to do about that, which is a great conflict in the story. So you have characters that you are already familiar with from the Doyle stories, and you have a historic event and historic characters that you are also familiar with from history, and so you've got this really well-known story, and the author needs to try and find a way of bringing something new to it, and I think she did a really good job in this book. I was really worried about where it was going, and it didn't go there, and I actually really liked the ending. I'm not going to spoil anything, don't worry, but I really liked where she went with the ending. I liked that she maintained the characters. The characters stayed true to what we know of the historical characters and what we expect of Doyle's characters. So that was great, and I really liked the relationship between Holmes and Watson in this book. I thought it stayed true to those characters, the relationship that you expect, but the conflict in the book of Watson being a prime suspect and Holmes trying to figure out what to do about that added an unexpected emotional element to the story that I ended up really, really liking. The plot, it was a fully developed plot. It was good pacing, and yeah, I was pleasantly surprised. I have to say, I was very leery heading into that story, but I ended up being super impressed with how she handled the historical element of it, how she handled Doyle's characters, but still managed to tell her own story. And yeah, so I ended up really liking Sherlock Holmes and the Ripper of Whitechapel. Then I read December Girl by Nicola Cassidy. This This one actually came out in 2017, but it is being promoted again now. I read this one through Book Sirens. So this one is not a historical mystery, it is a historical fiction. So the book opens in 1896 in London, and you are reading the story from the perspective of Molly. So it's told in the first person, and Molly is out at the shops with her baby, and her baby gets taken. And so that's like the very beginning of the story. And so the kind of main conflict throughout the story is what happened to Molly's baby. Will she ever find her baby? Who took her baby? All of that. But the timeline moves around all over the place, and you also get it from multiple perspectives. So we have the perspective of Molly, which is first person, present tense. You also have Henry, and that story is told in the third person. And then you also have Gladys, and that's also told from the third person. This is definitely a non-linear timeline because each of those three narrators, their timelines go back and forward in time. So I think this goes from between 1894 to 1920, I think, or 25. Like, there's a pretty big span in time, and each of those three narrators move back and forwards in time. So I ended up having a really hard time with this book. The non-linear timeline and three different narrators ended up being just confusing, and so there were chapters that were like, this is from Molly's perspective, or this is from Henry or from Gladys, and so that was good, and sometimes told you where it was and when it was, because the story also moves between London and Ireland, and I forget where in Ireland, but the time and place isn't always listed. And so in the end, I ended up being really confused in this story, who was narrating and when in the timeline it was. And then the author also tried to do first person present tense for Molly, which is a really complicated method of storytelling that is not easy even for an established writer to pull off, and unfortunately this author didn't pull it off with Molly. Sometimes it was present tense, sometimes it was past tense. Yeah, so that was a little bit unclear as well. The story itself, I think had a lot of potential. So the story, really, it's the story of Molly, who has a difficult childhood in Ireland and escapes to London only to have her new baby kidnapped. And so the plot had a lot of potential, and the characters were interesting. I enjoyed the time period and the character development. The characters did feel like real people, but ultimately I was just too confused as I was reading the story, and so I gave it 3 stars. And then I read Murder by Milk Bottle by Lynne Truss. This is the third in her Constable Twitton series. I had not read any in this series before this book. Lynne Truss famously wrote Eat, Shoots, Leaves, which is the non-fiction book about punctuation that she is famous for. And so I thought it was really interesting that she turned her hand to historical mysteries. So this book is set in 1957 in Brighton. And the main character is Constable Peregrine Peregrine Twitton, and he is 22 years old. He is relatively newly trained as a police officer. The book takes place over a long weekend in August, the bank holiday weekend. There are 3 murders all in one night, and they are all linked because they are all murdered in the same manner. So you have a beauty contest runner-up, an AA patrolman, so that's like a car, like our CAA over here in Canada and the States, car repair, tow truck kind of thing, and a visiting radio celebrity, and they have all been hit over the head with a full milk bottle and then stabbed with the broken remains. So that's a little bit gross. But I loved this story so much. Lynne Truss is hysterical. I mean, if it's your kind of humor, you'll find it hysterical, and if it's not, then you might not like it very much. But I found it very funny. It was hysterical, very witty, very well written. The characters were like just awesome. Like it's definitely quirky, and so I mean you have to just go along with it. But I love that she's created this world that lives in juxtaposition. So you've got Brighton, which is a classic British seaside resort, and especially over the August long weekend, you are going to have the town cram full of tourists, families that want to, like, you know, visit the beach and the pier and the amusement arcade and all of the shows going on. And so you've got this touristy world, this family environment, juxtapositioned with the criminal underworld. So you've got all of these gangs and criminals that are scheming and planning and doing things. So I love this juxtaposition that she has in the stories. And the characters are just great. I mean, Constable Twitton, he's this young police officer. He loves that he is finally trained and is, you know, being a police officer, and he wants to do well. But he is super, super intelligent. He is very, very clever, but also just not really cognizant of how he is perceived by others. And so most other people find him just super annoying because he just says whatever he's thinking, and he will often, like, inadvertently call people stupid because they haven't, like, gotten to where he has gotten in his thinking. He's got an inspector who doesn't really want to be an inspector. He would prefer to just, you know, appear on radio and give talks about obscure laws, and, you know, he kind of is in denial about the criminal element in Brighton. And there's a Sergeant Brunswick, who likes certain elements of being a police officer. So, you know, he loves, like, catching the criminals and running down the gangs, and he likes to go undercover and kind of the action elements of being a police officer. And I loved it. I just loved it so much. I gave it 5 stars. I went and got the first book from the library. I've now bought the first 2 in the series because I love it. I love it so much. They are fun, they are quirky, they are witty, yeah, I can highly recommend the Constable Twitton series. And then I read Murder in Old Bombay by Nev Marsh. This is another historical mystery, but this one is set in India in 1892. It's told in the first person from the perspective of Captain James Agnihotri. He is a former cavalry man who is now a journalist, but more of a private investigator. So the book opens, he is in hospital, and he has been recovering in hospital for quite some time. He was involved in a skirmish, let us say, with his squadron, and and he was injured severely, and he's been recuperating in the hospital. And he reads in the newspaper about 2 young women who fell to their deaths from the clock tower. And he was just intrigued by the story. The people were arrested and put on trial, but were not convicted. There was questions of whether it was suicide or murder. And the husband of one of these women was quoted as saying, "They are gone, but I remain." And something about that quote makes Captain James really interested. And so he goes and gets a job at a newspaper, and then he goes to this husband and tells him that he wants to look into the story, to write the story. And then this guy ends up actually hiring him as a private investigator to look into what actually happened to these 2 women. James, his hero, is Sherlock Holmes. He's read the 2 books over and over again, the Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four. And he loves Sherlock Holmes. He wants to emulate Sherlock Holmes as a private investigator. He loves the fact that he can use disguises in his investigation. And so that's kind of the basic plot. But this was a great story. I think, like, it's a historical mystery, but I found it to be so much more than that. It felt like epic historical fiction. There was adventure, there's a bit of romance, there was family secrets, there's themes of loyalty and religion and patriotism. There was a great sense of time and place. The author was really descriptive. I was really drawn into the story. The author takes her time to tell this story. It's a long book, and this investigation takes a long time. But I was never bored. I was always invested in the story. I really, really enjoyed it, and I gave it 5 stars. And then I read Kiss of Salt by Smita Bhattacharya. I'm very sorry, I'm probably not saying that last name correctly. This is the first of Darya's misadventures, as the author calls the series. This came out in 2019, and it is set in Goa on the southwestern coast of India in 2009. The story is told from the 3rd person. Darya goes to Halakonia Lane to clear out her recently deceased uncle's house. 20 years before, his wife had disappeared, and they never found out what happened to her. Some family members believe her to be dead, other family members believe that she is still alive, but no one knows the truth of what happened 20 years before, and she's never been seen since. And so Darya goes to clean out her recently deceased uncle's house, and in doing so discovers certain family secrets, and there is a murder while that happens. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was really interesting. I loved the setting. I don't really know anything about Goa, and I learned about the connection with Portugal, which I thought was really interesting, and they talked about that in the story. There were themes of family secrets, lies, loyalty, close-knit community. There's only 3 houses on this lane that's right on the coast, and all those 3 families are connected in some way. I loved that at the very end there was this classic Agatha Christie type gathering of the suspects in order to reveal the truth, with a very un-Agatha Christie twist. So I really enjoyed this, and I would read more from this author. I gave it 4 stars. And then I read The Sea Gate by Jane Johnson. This is a story. It's historical fiction in the sense that there are dual timelines. So it's set in Cornwall. You have present day with Becky, and that's told in the first person. And then you have Olivia from 1943. So in the story, Becky discovers a cousin that she never knew about. And this is an elderly cousin who really needs some help. And so Becky goes to Cornwall to help. This woman's in the hospital. Her house needs to be kind of brought up to code so that it's safe for her to go home. But Becky had never heard, or if she had heard of this cousin, she'd forgotten. They never really talked about her. And so she goes to help her out. And then you also then learn more about her, Olivia, as a teenager in the Second World War. I found the beginning to be quite slow, and I wasn't super interested until about 100 pages in, when Becky discovers a finger bone in the cellar, and then suddenly I was quite interested in the story. There was an unexpected third narrator, which was also told in the first person, but that only happened a couple of times. There was definitely the main theme here is family secrets. And this one was, in the end, I found it was just okay for me. It was a fairly good historical fiction. I gave it 3 stars. It was well written. The author did a good job of maintaining that first person present tense for Becky. There were certain elements of the World War II timeline that were different. I mean, there's a lot of World War II fiction out right now, and I thought the author managed to bring in new and slightly different elements of that to the story, so I thought that was good. And then I read Murder in the Snow by Verity Bright. This is the 4th in her Lady Eleanor Swift series. I love this series. And I love the characters, and so I knew that I would really enjoy this story. It is set at Christmas time, which is really fun. Lady Eleanor, it's a historical mystery story set in 1920. Lady Eleanor is hosting a Christmas party for the village at Henley Hall, and one of the fun run participants collapses and dies during the race. And so Lady Eleanor and her fantastic butler Clifford investigate, because the police at first aren't convinced that it's even murder. They think that he just died of a heart attack during the race. And of course Lady Eleanor feels, because he died at her house while she was hosting a party, that she needs to find out what's going on. It was a great mystery. There was a small group of suspects, an unclear method of murder, past secrets and present conflicts. So it was a really great mystery, but I just loved that we got to know Lady Eleanor and Clifford, her butler, better in this story. We learn a little bit more about her uncle who had died, and she had inherited his house and the title. So you learn a little bit more about that. But I just really love the characters of Lady Eleanor and Clifford, and so I love that you learn more about them and their relationship in this series. I just really enjoy it, and I gave it 5 stars. So those are the advanced reader copies that I read in November. These are all out now. I had a really good reading month, and I would just love to know, have you read any of the series? There was a couple of these that were part of a series, and if you've read any of those series before, I would love to know, and we can chat about that in the comment section down below. Do any of these books sound interesting to you? I would love to know about that as well, and I will see you for another video soon. Bye.